The crack of a leather belt echoed through the small cabin as Pearl Montgomery flinched, her body already aching from the previous blows. Dust particles danced in the fading sunlight streaming through the windows of her home on the outskirts of Dalhart, Texas, the harsh summer of 1878 bringing little comfort to her troubled life. "You call this food?" Her husband Vernon spat, overturning the skillet of scorched beans and salt pork onto the rough-hewn floor. "Can't even cook a simple supper without burning it to hell and back." Pearl, 22 years old with eyes the color of summer sage, pressed herself against the wall, her calloused hands trembling. "I'm sorry, Vernon. The stove was running too hot and I was tending to the wash. Excuses." Vernon's face contorted with rage, the whiskey on his breath filling the space between them. At 38, he had grown increasingly bitter since their marriage 3 years prior. The drought had withered his crops, and the failing farm had withered his spirit, leaving Pearl to bear the brunt of his frustrations. "Clean this mess up," he growled, grabbing his hat from the peg by the door. "I'm heading to town. Maybe I can find something edible there, since my wife can't manage to feed me proper." The door slammed behind him, and Pearl slid down the wall, her fingers gingerly touching the welt forming on her cheek. Tears carved clean tracks through the soot on her face, as she surveyed the ruined supper scattered across the floor. 3 years of marriage to Vernon Montgomery had taught Pearl to expect such treatment. The charming man who had courted her after her parents died of fever had quickly revealed his true nature once the wedding vows were spoken. Isolated on their struggling homestead 5 miles outside Dalhart, she had nowhere to turn, no family to shelter her. The sound of hooves outside startled her from her misery. Vernon couldn't be back so soon, and they rarely had visitors. Hastily wiping her tears, Pearl rose to her feet, wincing at the pain in her ribs as she peered through the window. A stranger sat atop a chestnut gelding, his broad-shouldered silhouette unfamiliar against the setting Texas sun. His clothes were dust-coated but of good quality, and the silver conchos on his saddle gleamed despite the layer of trail grime covering them. "Hello," his deep voice called out. "Pardon the intrusion, madam, but my horse has picked up a stone. Might I trouble you for some water and a moment to tend to him?" Pearl hesitated, knowing Vernon would be furious to find a stranger at their home. But the man's tone was respectful, and she couldn't bring herself to turn away someone in need. Composing herself as best she could, she opened the door, keeping her bruised cheek angled away from view. "Of course, sir. There's a water trough around the side. You're welcome to use it." The stranger tipped his hat, revealing a handsome face with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Much obliged, madam." He paused, noticing the way she held herself, the subtle guarding of her injured side. "Name's Xavier Yates, just passing through on my way to the goodnight-loving trail." "Pearl Montgomery," she replied softly, maintaining her distance. "My husband's just gone to town, but he'll be back shortly." Xavier nodded, leading his horse to the trough. Pearl watched from the doorway, uncertain what to do next. The burning smell from her ruined supper wafted through the open door, a humiliating reminder of her failure. "Something smells interesting," Xavier commented with a gentle smile as he returned, his horse's issue apparently resolved. "Reminds me of my sister's cooking." She could burn water if you let her. Despite herself, Pearl felt a small smile touch her lips. "I'm afraid supper didn't turn out as intended." Xavier glanced past her to the mess on the floor, his expression shifting subtly as he took in the overturned skillet and scattered food. His gaze moved to her face, and she knew he had spotted the mark on her cheek. "Looks like you've had some trouble," he said carefully, his voice neutral but his eyes telling a different story. "Would it be improper of me to offer assistance in cleaning up?" Pearl stiffened. "No, thank you, Mr. Yates, I can manage." "Xavier, please." He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair flecked with trail dust. "And I don't doubt you can manage, Mrs. Montgomery, but sometimes an extra hand makes the work go faster." Before Pearl could protest further, he stepped past her into the cabin, respectfully keeping a proper distance but surveying the scene with calm assessment. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal in weeks," he said conversationally, as if ignoring the evidence of violence around him. "Been living off trail biscuits and jerky. Even burned beans would be a welcome change." Pearl stood frozen, torn between propriety and the unexpected kindness of this stranger. Xavier moved with surprising grace for a man of his size, retrieving the fallen skillet and placing it back on the stove. "There's still some beans in here that might be salvageable," he said, examining the contents. "Do you have any more ingredients? Perhaps we could cobble together a new supper." "Why would you help me?" Pearl asked, confused by his behavior. Most men would have ridden away, wanting nothing to do with another man's domestic troubles. Xavier's expression grew serious. "My mother taught me two things, Mrs. Montgomery. First, never pass by someone in need without offering help. Second, always be grateful for whatever meal is placed before you." Pearl hesitated, then moved cautiously to the small pantry. "I have some cornmeal and a bit of salt pork left, and there are eggs from the hens." "Perfect," Xavier said with genuine enthusiasm. "With your permission, I'd like to stay for supper. In exchange, I'll help prepare it. I'm not half bad at cornbread, though my biscuits are questionable at best." Despite the pain and humiliation of the past hour, Pearl found herself nodding. There was something about Xavier Yates that felt safe, his presence somehow solid and reassuring in her tumultuous world. Together, they set about preparing a new meal. Xavier retrieved water from the well outside while Pearl mixed cornmeal with the last of her buttermilk. He showed her a trick for seasoning the beans that his mother had taught him, adding a pinch of sugar to cut the bitterness of the slightly scorched portions. "Where are you headed, Mr. Yates Xavier?" Pearl asked as they worked, finding comfort in the simple domestic task shared with someone who didn't look at her with contempt. "I've taken a job with the J.A. Ranch," he explained, expertly slicing the salt pork. "Worked cattle in Colorado the past few years, but Texas has been calling me back." "Something about the Panhandle gets in your blood. You're from Texas originally, born in San Antonio," he confirmed. "My father ran a mercantile there, but I wasn't suited for shopkeeping, preferred the open country. When he passed, I sold the business and took to ranching." Pearl found herself sharing bits of her own story as they cooked how she'd come from Missouri with her parents as a girl. How they'd settled near Dalhart with dreams of prosperous farming. How fever had taken them 3 years ago, leaving her alone until Vernon had come courting. She carefully omitted the details of her marriage, but Xavier's observant eyes missed little. When she reached for a bowl on a high shelf and winced at the pain in her ribs, his jaw tightened momentarily before he politely took over the task. By the time the meal was ready, a strange sense of camaraderie had developed between them. The cornbread emerged from the oven golden and fragrant, the beans were seasoned to perfection, and Pearl had managed to fry the eggs without breaking a single yolk. "This looks magnificent," Xavier declared, surveying their creation. "Best meal I've seen in months." Pearl's cheeks colored at the compliment. "It's nothing fancy." "The best meals rarely are," he replied, accepting the plate she offered him. They sat at the small table, an appropriate distance between them as propriety demanded, and Xavier removed his hat and bowed his head briefly before taking his first bite. His expression of appreciation seemed genuine as he tasted the food. "Mrs. Montgomery, these are possibly the best beans I've had since leaving home," he said after swallowing. "Would you be offended if I asked for seconds once I finish this plate?" Pearl stared at him in disbelief. No one had ever praised her cooking before. Vernon constantly criticized her efforts, no matter how hard she tried to please him. "You don't need to say such things out of politeness, Mr. Yates." "Xavier," he corrected gently, "and I wouldn't. My mother also taught me never to lie about a woman's cooking. It's a matter of honor." His smile was warm, reaching his eyes. "These beans have just the right amount of smoke flavor to them. Some might call it burned, but I call it character." A small laugh escaped Pearl's lips before she could contain it, the sound almost foreign to her ears. How long had it been since she'd laughed? Their meal continued with easy conversation, Xavier sharing tales of cattle drives and the characters he'd met along the trails. Pearl found herself relaxing despite the knowledge that Vernon would return eventually, possibly drunk and certainly angry. As if reading her thoughts, Xavier glanced toward the window at the darkening sky. "Your husband has been gone some time. Town's not far, is it?" 5 miles, Pearl replied, tension returning to her shoulders. "He often stays late when he goes in, the saloon." Xavier nodded in understanding. "I should be on my way before he returns. I wouldn't want to cause any complications." The unspoken acknowledgement of her situation hung in the air between them, Pearl began gathering the dishes, her movements quick and nervous. "Mrs. Montgomery," Xavier said quietly, "I'll be staying in Dalhart for a few days before heading on to the JA Ranch. If you should need anything, supplies, assistance of any kind, I'll be at the Cattleman's Hotel." Pearl kept her eyes on the dishes. "That's kind but unnecessary. I'm well provided for." Xavier rose from his chair, placing his hat back on his head. "Nevertheless, the offer stands." He moved to the door, then hesitated. "One more thing, if I may. My mother had a saying about difficult situations: even the longest night ends with dawn." With that, he thanked her for the meal, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving Pearl standing in the doorway of her cabin, watching his figure disappear into the gathering darkness. For the first time in years, a tiny spark of something like hope flickered in her chest. But reality crashed back upon her with the distant sound of hoofbeats an hour later. Vernon's return sent her scurrying to ensure all evidence of Xavier's visit was erased. The extra plate washed and put away, the amount of food carefully adjusted to appear as though only she had eaten. Vernon burst through the door, reeking of whiskey and smoke. His bloodshot eyes narrowed as he surveyed the cabin. "Place smells different," he slurred, stumbling toward the stove where Pearl had kept a portion of the meal warm for him. "I made fresh cornbread and beans," she said quickly. "After I cleaned up my mistake." Vernon grunted, helping himself to the food without thanks. Pearl held her breath as he took the first bite, praying he wouldn't detect the different seasoning, the evidence of another's hand in its preparation. "Still tastes burned," he muttered, but continued eating, too hungry and drunk to care much about the quality. Pearl exhaled quietly in relief. That night, as she lay beside her snoring husband, Pearl found her thoughts drifting to Xavier Yates, to his kindness and the respect he had shown her. She knew such thoughts were dangerous, inappropriate for a married woman. Yet the memory of his words, "even the longest night ends with dawn," gave her a strange comfort as she drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Vernon was in a foul mood, his head pounding from the previous night's excesses. He barely spoke to Pearl as he prepared for the day's work, gulping down the coffee she placed before him and ignoring the biscuits she'd risen early to bake. "Need supplies," he grumbled as he headed out the door. "I'll be back this evening. Have supper ready properly this time." Pearl set about her daily chores with a renewed sense of purpose. The laundry was completed early, the chicken coop cleaned, eggs gathered, and floors swept, all while her mind churned with thoughts she dared not fully acknowledge. By midday, a decision had formed in her heart. She couldn't continue living this way, accepting Vernon's cruelty as her lot in life. Xavier's kindness had reminded her that not all men were like her husband, that perhaps somewhere a different life awaited her. With trembling hands, she packed a small bundle, a change of clothes, her mother's locket, the few coins she had secretly saved from selling excess eggs to neighbors. It wasn't much, but it might buy her passage somewhere far from Vernon's reach. The 5-mile walk to Dalhart would be the first step. What came after, she couldn't say. Perhaps Xavier would help her find work at the JA Ranch, or direct her to a town where a woman alone might find respectable employment. Or perhaps she would simply keep moving until Vernon could never find her again. Pearl was just tying her bundle when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, not just Vernon's mare. Panic seized her as she quickly hid the bundle beneath the bed and smoothed her apron. 3 riders appeared in the yard: Vernon, the sheriff from Dalhart, and a third man Pearl didn't recognize. Vernon's face was thunderous as he dismounted and stormed toward the cabin. "You lying, cheating woman," he roared, flinging open the door with such force it cracked against the wall. "Did you think I wouldn't find out about your visitor yesterday?" Pearl's blood ran cold. "Vernon, I don't know what you're talking about." His hand struck her face before she could finish, sending her stumbling backward into the table. "Don't lie to me. Jake Thornton saw a cowboy leaving our property yesterday evening, said you two looked mighty friendly." The sheriff stepped into the cabin, his expression uncomfortable but not particularly sympathetic. "Mrs. Montgomery, your husband has made some serious accusations, claims you've been entertaining a man while he's away." "It wasn't like that," Pearl protested, her cheek stinging from the blow. "He was just a traveler needing water for his horse. We shared a meal, nothing more." "Shared a meal?" Vernon's face purpled with rage. In my house with my food, the third man, who Pearl now recognized as the local preacher, Reverend Collins, moved between them. Now, Vernon, let's not jump to conclusions. Perhaps your wife is telling the truth. She burned my supper, then cooked for another man, Vernon shouted. Everyone in town knows she's useless as a wife. Can't cook, can't give me children. Now she's bringing shame on my name with her loose behavior. Pearl's shame turned to anger at his public humiliation of her. 3 years of mistreatment crystallized into a moment of courage as she straightened her spine and faced the men. I have never been unfaithful, she said clearly, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. The traveler was kind when my husband had just beaten me for burning beans. That's all. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, his eyes taking in the bruise blooming on Pearl's cheekbone. Is that true, Vernon? Reverend Collins asked quietly. Have you been striking your wife? A man has the right to discipline his household, Vernon replied defensively. She's my wife. The law says I can correct her as needed. The sheriff sighed, clearly wishing to be anywhere but in the middle of a domestic dispute. That may be so, Vernon, but there's discipline and then there's what folks might call excessive force. Who was this traveler? The Reverend asked Pearl, his tone gentler. Pearl hesitated, reluctant to bring trouble to Xavier. Just a cowboy passing through. He said his name was Xavier Yates, headed for the J.A. ranch. The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly. Yates, I met him yesterday when he checked into the cattleman's, seemed a respectable sort. See, Vernon jabbed a finger toward Pearl. She even remembers his name. Probably arranged for him to come back when I'm gone again. I did no such thing, Pearl protested. The argument might have continued indefinitely had fate not intervened in the form of approaching hoofbeats. All 4 occupants of the cabin turned toward the door as Xavier Yates himself appeared in the yard, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. Vernon's face contorted with fury. That's him, he snarled, lunging toward the door. The sheriff caught his arm. Easy now, Montgomery. Let's hear what the man has to say. Xavier dismounted, immediately sensing the tension. He removed his hat as he approached the cabin, his posture non-threatening but his eyes alert as he took in the scene before him. Afternoon, he said calmly. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. What business do you have here? Vernon demanded, shaking off the sheriff's hand. Xavier's gaze moved briefly to Pearl, noting her reddened cheek and the fear in her eyes. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he returned his attention to Vernon. Mr. Montgomery, I presume. I wanted to properly thank your wife for her hospitality yesterday and return the favor. I've brought some supplies, flour, coffee, sugar. The storekeeper in town mentioned the drought had hit this area hard. He gestured to the pack mule. Consider it payment for the meal I enjoyed, Vernon scoffed. We don't need your charity. It's not charity, sir, Xavier replied evenly. Where I come from, debts are paid. Your wife provided me with a fine meal when I was hungry, and I'm simply returning the kindness. The Reverend stepped forward. That seems a Christian gesture, Vernon. Perhaps we've misunderstood the situation. Vernon wasn't mollified. And you just happen to know exactly what supplies we needed. Been discussing our private affairs with my wife, have you? Xavier's patience visibly thinned. Sir, I purchased what any homestead might require. I meant no offense. The sheriff, clearly eager to diffuse the tension, intervened. Well, seems to me there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Yates here was just being neighborly, Vernon. No call for accusations. Vernon glared at the men surrounding him, realizing he was outnumbered. Fine, he spat. Leave the supplies if it eases your conscience, then get off my property and stay away from my wife. Xavier's eyes hardened, but he nodded curtly. As you wish. He turned to Pearl, maintaining a respectful distance. Madam, I apologize for any trouble I've caused. Pearl couldn't meet his gaze, fear of Vernon's retribution once they were alone again overwhelming her. Thank you for the supplies, Mr. Yates. It was unnecessary. Xavier unloaded the supplies from the mule, placing them on the porch under Vernon's watchful glare. The sheriff and Reverend, satisfied that the situation was resolved, prepared to depart. Montgomery, the sheriff said quietly to Vernon, I'd suggest you remember that while the law gives a man certain rights in his home, it doesn't smile on excessive force. Folks in town talk, you understand. Vernon's expression darkened, but he nodded stiffly. The warning was clear. The sheriff might look the other way for minor domestic matters, but public brutality would not be tolerated. As the men prepared to leave, Xavier lingered a moment longer than necessary, his back to Vernon as he adjusted his saddle. When Pearl stepped onto the porch to retrieve the supplies, he spoke quietly, just loud enough for her alone to hear. "Cattle Drive leaves from the north edge of town at dawn tomorrow. If you need it, there'll be a place for you." Before Pearl could respond, he mounted his horse and rode away, the sheriff and reverend following shortly after. Vernon stormed into the cabin, slamming the door behind him and leaving Pearl alone on the porch with the supplies and an impossible decision. That night was the longest of Pearl's life. Vernon, humiliated by the day's events and fueled by the whiskey he'd brought home, alternated between sullen silence and vicious verbal attacks. He didn't strike her again. The sheriff's warning had apparently made some impression, but his words cut deeper than blows. "Worthless woman," he muttered as he drank. "Making me look a fool in front of the whole town. Should have left you to starve after your parents died." Pearl moved silently around the cabin, preparing the evening meal from the fresh supplies Xavier had brought, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. The cattle drive leaving at dawn represented both escape and terrible risk. If she fled and Vernon found her, there would be no mercy. If she stayed, she faced a lifetime of abuse that would only worsen after today's humiliation. As Vernon finally passed out in their bed, Pearl sat by the dying fire, the bundle she had prepared earlier clutched in her hands. Dawn would come in just a few hours. With it, a chance she might never have again. The decision, when it finally crystallized, brought with it a strange calm. Pearl moved with quiet efficiency, adding a few more items to her bundle, including some of the supplies Xavier had brought. She changed into her sturdiest dress and boots, wrapped her mother's shawl around her shoulders against the pre-dawn chill, and took one last look around the cabin that had been her prison for 3 years. Vernon's snores continued uninterrupted as she slipped out the door just as the eastern sky began to lighten. The 5-mile walk to Dalhart would take over an hour, but if she hurried, she might reach the north edge of town before the cattle drive departed. Each step away from the cabin lightened her heart despite the fear coursing through her veins. The road stretched before her, dusty and familiar, yet somehow knew now that she traveled it for herself, not on Vernon's errands. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon when Pearl spotted the cattle herd on the outskirts of Dalhart, cowboys already mounted and preparing to move out. Her pace quickened, hope and anxiety battling within her chest. Xavier saw her before she reached them, breaking away from the group to ride toward her. He dismounted quickly, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "You came," he said simply. Pearl nodded, suddenly uncertain in the face of her own boldness. "I couldn't stay, not anymore." Xavier's gaze took in her bundle, the determined set of her shoulders and the fear still lingering in her eyes. "When he discovers you're gone." "He'll come looking," Pearl finished. "I know. Are you certain this is what you want? The trail is hard, especially for a woman." Pearl straightened her spine. "What I want is a life where I'm not afraid every day, where I can burn beans without being beaten for it, where I might someday be valued for more than my ability to serve a man who despises me." Xavier's expression softened. "Then you've made the right choice." He gestured toward the herd. "The trail boss is a good man, Pike Garrison. He's agreed to let you travel with us as far as Dodge City as the cook's assistant. From there, you can take the train east if you wish." "Why are you helping me?" Pearl asked, the question that had burned in her mind since their first meeting. Xavier's eyes held her steadily. "Because 20 years ago, my mother fled a similar situation with 2 small children in tow. A stranger helped her reach safety. I promised myself I'd do the same if ever given the chance. Understanding passed between them, a connection forged by shared knowledge of suffering and the courage to oppose it. I have no money to pay my way," Pearl admitted. "Just a few coins." "Your cooking skills are payment enough," Xavier assured her. "Trail crews value a decent meal above most comforts." He helped her onto his horse, then led it toward the waiting herd. The trail boss, a weathered man with a silver-streaked beard, assessed Pearl with shrewd but not unkind eyes. "Mrs. Montgomery," he acknowledged with a nod. "Yates here says you can cook. That true, or is he sweet on you and exaggerating your talents?" Despite the gravity of her situation, Pearl felt a blush warm her cheeks. "I can cook, Mr. Garrison, though some might disagree on how well." Pike Garrison's mouth twitched slightly. "We'll be the judge of that. Cookie can use the help, and it's a long drive to Dodge." He gestured toward the chuck wagon. "You'll ride there with Sam. He's ornery but fair. Don't let him bully you about his domain." Within the hour, the herd was moving north, dust rising in clouds as the cattle shuffled along. Pearl sat beside Sam, the elderly cook whose gruff exterior barely concealed a kind heart. He questioned her knowledge of trail cooking, seemed satisfied with her answers, and promptly put her to work peeling potatoes for the midday meal. Xavier rode alongside the wagon periodically, checking on her welfare without being obvious about it. Each time their eyes met, Pearl felt a strange flutter in her chest, something between gratitude and a feeling she dared not name. By mid-morning, Vernon would have discovered her absence. By afternoon, he would be in Dalhart, questioning townsfolk. But the cattle drive moved steadily northward, putting precious miles between Pearl and her past with every hour. That evening, as the herd settled and the cowboys gathered for supper, Pearl found herself truly cooking for an appreciative audience for the first time in her life. The trail fare was simple beans, biscuits, and beef, but the men praised it enthusiastically, particularly the biscuits she had insisted on adding to the usual menu. "These are lighter than cloud fluff," one cowboy declared, reaching for his third biscuit. "Where'd you learn to bake like this, madam?" "My mother taught me," Pearl replied, warmed by the genuine appreciation. "She always said the secret was cold hands and a light touch." Sam, the cook, harumphed but couldn't hide his approval. "Might have to keep you on permanent, Mrs. Montgomery. These boys'll mutiny if they have to go back to my biscuits after tasting yours." Pearl smiled, fatigue and anxiety temporarily forgotten in the simple pleasure of being valued for her skills. As the men finished eating and moved off to attend to evening chores, Xavier approached the chuck wagon. "The men are impressed," he said, accepting the coffee she offered. "Sam hasn't let anyone touch his biscuit recipe in 15 years. "He's been very kind," Pearl replied, settling onto a crate across from Xavier. "Everyone has." Xavier's expression grew serious. "Pike sent a man back to keep watch behind us. No sign of pursuit yet, but we should be prepared. Your husband won't give up easily." Pearl's momentary contentment evaporated. "No, he won't. Vernon has never accepted defeat in anything." "We'll keep you safe," Xavier promised. "Once we cross into no man's land, he'll have no legal jurisdiction to force your return." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the campfire crackling nearby, stars beginning to appear in the vast Texas sky. For the first time in years, Pearl felt a sense of peace despite the danger trailing behind them. "Thank you," she said softly, "not just for the help but for—" She hesitated, struggling to articulate what his kindness had meant to her. "For tasting my burned beans and asking for seconds. It may seem a small thing to you, but it reminded me that I'm not what Vernon says I am." Xavier's eyes reflected the firelight as he held her gaze. "You're not," he agreed. "You're much more than you've been allowed to believe, Mrs. Montgomery." "Pearl," she corrected gently. "I think, under the circumstances, you should call me Pearl." His smile warmed her more than the fire. "Pearl, then, and you should rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." As Pearl settled into her bedroll beneath the chuck wagon that night, the unfamiliar sounds of the cattle herd and snoring cowboys surrounding her, she felt a curious sense of homecoming. As if this rough camp under the endless stars was somehow more her true place than the cabin she had shared with Vernon had ever been. The next 3 days established a rhythm as the herd moved steadily northward. Pearl rose before dawn to help Sam prepare breakfast, spent the day riding the wagon and assisting with meal preparations, and gradually earned the respect of the entire crew with her cooking and quiet determination. Xavier remained a constant, protective presence, teaching her about the cattle drive, explaining the cowboys' various roles, and sharing stories of his travels across the Western Territories. Their conversations flowed easily, his respect for her evident in the way he listened to her opinions and valued her contributions. On the 4th day, as they approached the border of no man's land, the territory between Texas and Kansas claimed by neither state, the rider Pike had stationed as rear guard galloped up to the chuck wagon where Pearl and Sam were preparing the midday meal. "Riders coming," he reported breathlessly. 4 of them pushing hard. One matches the description of Montgomery. Pearl's hands froze in the act of kneading dough, fear clutching at her throat. Xavier, who had been helping repair a broken wagon wheel nearby, straightened immediately. "How far?" he asked sharply. "Hour, maybe less at their pace," the guard replied. "They're riding hard." Pike Garrison approached, his expression grim. "We can't outrun them with the herd. Mrs. Montgomery, you have choices to make, and quickly." Pearl wiped the flour from her hands, mind racing. "What options do I have?" "Three, as I see it," Pike said bluntly. "You can continue with us and face whatever comes when they catch up. You can take a horse and ride ahead to the border, hoping to cross before they catch you. Or you can hide somewhere along the trail while we delay them, then continue on once they've passed." Xavier stepped forward. "I'll take her to the border. We can reach it in half an hour if we ride hard." Pike considered this, then nodded. "Take my buckskin, he's the fastest mount we have." As Sam and the others quickly gathered supplies for their journey, Xavier helped Pearl onto the trail boss's prized horse. "Hold tight," he instructed, mounting behind her. "It won't be a comfortable ride, but speed matters more than comfort now." With a shout of farewell from the crew, they galloped northward, leaving the slow-moving herd behind. Pearl clung to the saddle horn, the powerful horse eating up the miles beneath them. Xavier's arms encircled her as he held the reins, his body solid and reassuring against her back. "Once we cross the border, he'll have no legal claim on you," Xavier reminded her, his breath warm against her ear as they rode. "No man's land has no formal law, but Vernon would be a fool to try to force you back once we're beyond Texas jurisdiction." Pearl nodded, unable to speak through her fear. The past 4 days had given her a taste of freedom she couldn't bear to lose. The thought of being dragged back to Vernon's cabin, to his rage and punishment, made her physically ill. They rode hard for nearly 30 minutes before Xavier pulled the buckskin to a halt atop a small rise. In the distance, a simple wooden marker indicated the border between Texas and no man's land. "We're almost there," Xavier said, relief evident in his voice. Just a bit further and he broke off suddenly, his body tensing. Pearl followed his gaze and felt her heart sink. In the distance, moving rapidly toward them from the northeast, were 4 riders. "They've cut across country," Xavier muttered, quickly assessing their options. "They'll intercept us before we reach the border." Pearl's hands tightened on the saddle horn. "What do we do?" Xavier was silent for a moment, clearly weighing their limited choices. "We can try to outrun them, but the horse is already winded, or we can make a stand here." "If we're caught in Texas, Vernon has the law on his side," Pearl reminded him, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I'm still his wife, and he can legally compel my return." Xavier's jaw tightened. "Then we make for the border, hold tight." He urged the buckskin forward again, pushing the tired animal to its limits. The border marker grew closer, but so did the approaching riders, now visible enough that Pearl could recognize Vernon's distinctive hat and burly frame in the lead. "Xavier," she said urgently, "if they catch us, promise me something." "Anything," he replied without hesitation. "Don't let him take me back. Whatever happens, whatever you have to do, don't let him take me back to that cabin." Xavier's arms tightened around her momentarily. "I promise," he said, his voice low and fierce. "You'll never go back to him, Pearl, not while I draw breath." They were less than 100 yards from the border when Vernon's voice rang out behind them. "Stop right there, you thieving bastard, that's my wife you're stealing." Xavier didn't slow, instead urging the buckskin to a final burst of speed. The border marker flashed past them just as Vernon and his companions closed the distance. "We're across," Xavier called triumphantly, finally slowing the exhausted horse. "We're in no man's land now, Pearl. He has no authority here." But Vernon showed no sign of respecting territorial boundaries. He and his 3 companions, whom Pearl recognized as men from Dalhart, known for their willingness to do Vernon's bidding for the price of a few drinks, continued their pursuit, drawing up alongside the buckskin moments later and forcing Xavier to halt. "Give me my wife," Vernon snarled, his face contorted with rage and the effects of what had clearly been days of hard drinking. "The law says she's mine, and I'm taking her home." Xavier remained calm, positioning himself slightly in front of Pearl. "We've crossed into no man's land, Montgomery. Texas law doesn't reach here. Your wife has chosen to leave you, and she's free to do so." Vernon scoffed. "There's no law here at all, which means I can do whatever's necessary to reclaim what's mine." He gestured to his companions, who spread out to surround Xavier and Pearl. "Hand her over peacefully or we'll take her by force." Pearl trembled but found her voice. "I'm never going back with you, Vernon, never." "You don't have a choice, woman," Vernon spat. "A wife belongs with her husband. This man has filled your head with foolish notions, but you'll remember your place once we're home." Xavier dismounted smoothly, helping Pearl down as well but keeping her behind him. 4 against 1 aren't favorable odds, Montgomery, he said evenly. "But I gave your wife my word that she wouldn't be forced to return with you. I intend to keep that promise." One of Vernon's companions, a rat-faced man named Silas, chuckled unpleasantly. "Sounds like you're sweet on another man's wife, Cowboy. That's a dangerous position to put yourself in." Vernon's eyes narrowed. "Last chance, Yates. Step aside and ride away. This isn't your concern." "I'm making it my concern," Xavier replied, his hand hovering near the revolver on his hip. "Mrs. Montgomery has chosen to leave your household. As we're outside Texas jurisdiction, she has every right to do so." Vernon's face darkened. "Then I'll just have to convince her otherwise." He dismounted, handing his reins to Silas. "Hold my horse, this won't take long." What happened next unfolded with frightening speed. Vernon lunged forward, clearly intending to push past Xavier and grab Pearl. Xavier blocked his path, shoving him backward. Vernon recovered quickly, drawing his pistol in one fluid motion. "Vernon, no," Pearl cried, but her words were lost in the explosion of gunfire. Xavier had drawn his own weapon with remarkable speed, firing at almost the same instant as Vernon. Both men staggered, Vernon clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers, Xavier grimacing as he pressed a hand to his side. Silas and the other men reached for their weapons, but froze as the thunder of approaching hooves announced the arrival of Pike Garrison and 6 of his cowboys, all armed and looking grimly determined. "That's far enough," Pike called, his rifle trained on Vernon's companions. "I suggest you boys reconsider your options." Vernon, wild-eyed with pain and fury, kept his gun leveled at Xavier despite his bleeding shoulder. "She's my wife. The law says we're not in Texas anymore," Pike interrupted. "And from what I've seen, any man who beats his wife for burning supper doesn't deserve to call her his own." Pearl rushed to Xavier's side, horrified to see blood staining his shirt. "You're hurt," she whispered, helping him to a sitting position on the ground. "Just a graze," he assured her, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "Are you all right?" She nodded, tears threatening to spill. "Because of you." Pike and his men quickly disarmed Vernon and his companions, the confrontation ending as abruptly as it had begun. With 6 guns trained on them, even Vernon recognized the futility of further resistance. "This isn't over," he snarled as one of the cowboys bound his wounded shoulder with a bandana. "She's still my wife under Texas law. I'll find a lawman who'll enforce that, even in this God-forsaken territory." Pike dismounted, approaching Vernon with dangerous calm. "Here's what's going to happen, Montgomery. You and your friends are going to turn around and ride back to Texas. Mrs. Montgomery will continue north with us to Dodge City. If you follow or cause any more trouble, I'll personally see that you regret it." "You can't, I can and I will," Pike cut him off. "I've got 20 armed men who'll back my play, and not a single one of them takes kindly to a man who beats his wife. Now mount up and go before I decide you need more convincing." Outmanned and outgunned, Vernon had no choice but to comply. As he mounted his horse, he fixed Pearl with a venomous glare. "This isn't finished between us. You'll always be my wife in the eyes of God and Texas law." Pearl, still supporting the wounded Xavier, met his gaze steadily. "No, Vernon, it is finished. I'm never coming back." With a final curse, Vernon wheeled his horse around and rode south, his companions following sullenly. Pike assigned 2 men to follow them at a distance, ensuring they truly departed. The immediate danger past, Pearl turned her full attention to Xavier's wound. With Sam's help, they cleaned and bandaged the bullet graze along his ribs. It was painful but not life-threatening, though Xavier would need to ride in the chuck wagon for a few days while he healed. That evening, as the herd settled for the night well within no man's land, Pearl sat beside Xavier's bedroll, providing him with a second helping of the stew she'd prepared. "You should rest," he told her, noticing the exhaustion in her eyes. "You're safe now. Vernon won't risk coming back with Pike and the boys watching for him." Pearl shook her head. I'll rest soon. I wanted to make sure you ate properly first. You need your strength to heal. Xavier smiled, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his injured side. Always taking care of others. Have you thought about what you'll do when we reach Dodge? The question had been weighing on Pearl's mind throughout the day. I'm not sure yet. Find work, perhaps. I can cook or clean. Maybe save enough for a train ticket farther east. Xavier hesitated, then reached for her hand. I have another suggestion if you'd consider it. The JA Ranch is still my destination after we reach Dodge. They're looking for a cook for the main house. The pay is good and it would be honest work in a respectable setting. Pearl's pulse quickened at his touch. That would mean staying in Texas. Eventually, yes, but Vernon wouldn't dare come onto Goodnight's property. Charles Goodnight doesn't tolerate troublemakers, and his word is law in that part of the Panhandle. Xavier squeezed her hand gently. You'd be safe there, Pearl, and I'd be nearby. The implication in his words made her cheeks warm. People would talk, a married woman taking such a position. People always talk, Xavier replied simply. What matters is that you'd have time to build a new life, to decide your own future without fear, and perhaps, eventually, to seek a proper divorce once enough time has passed. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. A divorce was nearly unheard of, especially for a woman of Pearl's modest means and standing. Yet the possibility of true freedom, of a life determined by her own choices rather than Vernon's demands, called to her powerfully. I'll consider it, she promised, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. Thank you, Xavier, not just for today, but for showing me that I had choices when I believed I had none. His eyes, warm in the firelight, held hers. You've always had choices, Pearl. You just needed to be reminded of your own strength to make them. As she finally settled into her own bedroll that night, Pearl felt something unfamiliar expanding in her chest. Hope, yes, but something more. A sense of possibility she hadn't experienced since before her parents' deaths, before Vernon had entered her life with his false promises and hidden cruelty. The journey to Dodge City took another 2 weeks, the cattle herd moving at its steady pace northward through no man's land. Xavier recovered quickly, though Pearl insisted he continue riding in the wagon for several days beyond what was strictly necessary, fussing over him in a way that drew knowing smiles from the other cowboys. During those days and nights on the trail, their relationship deepened beyond mere friendship. Never crossing the boundaries of propriety, Pearl was still a married woman. Regardless of her estrangement from Vernon, they nonetheless found countless ways to express their growing affection. Xavier would bring her wildflowers gathered during the day's ride. Pearl would save the choicest portions of each meal for him, adding special touches she knew he enjoyed. Their conversations lasted late into the evening after the other men had retired, sharing stories of their pasts and cautious hopes for the future. Pearl learned of Xavier's childhood in San Antonio, his difficult relationship with his father who had wanted him to take over the family business, and his mother's quiet support of his dreams to work the open range. In turn, she shared memories of her parents, of the happiness they'd known before illness claimed them, and of her own youthful aspirations before Vernon had systematically crushed them beneath his boot heel. By the time they reached Dodge City, Kansas, Pearl had made her decision. She would accept the position at the JA Ranch, giving herself time to establish independence before determining her next steps. The prospect of remaining near Xavier influenced her choice more than she cared to admit, even to herself. Dodge City in 1878 was a booming cattle town, its streets teeming with cowboys fresh off the trail, merchants eager for their business, and the various entertainments that catered to men with money to spend after months of hard work. Pike secured rooms for Pearl and the other trail hands at a respectable boarding house, well away from the saloons and dance halls of the notorious Front Street. Their arrival coincided with that of a circuit judge, a fortunate timing that Xavier suggested they take advantage of. While Pearl settled into her temporary lodgings, he sought legal advice regarding her situation. The judge says your case isn't uncommon, Xavier reported that evening as they sat in the boarding house's modest parlor, the landlady keeping watchful eye from her knitting chair across the room. While Texas doesn't recognize abandonment as grounds for divorce, cruelty is a possible avenue, if you were to file in Kansas or Colorado and could provide witnesses to Vernon's treatment of you." Pearl twisted her hands in her lap. The sheriff and Reverend Collins saw the aftermath, but not the beatings themselves, and bringing such private matters before a court. She shuddered at the thought of publicly detailing Vernon's cruelties. Xavier nodded in understanding. "There's another option. If you establish residence in another state for a sufficient period, usually 6 months to a year, you could file there under their laws, which might be more favorable." "A year is a long time to live in uncertainty," Pearl murmured. "It is," Xavier agreed, "but you wouldn't be alone, Pearl. Whatever path you choose, I'll support you however I can." The landlady cleared her throat meaningfully, reminding them of her presence and the need for propriety. Xavier smiled ruefully and changed the subject to their impending journey to the JA Ranch, scheduled to begin in 3 days once Pike had concluded his business in Dodge. Those 3 days passed quickly, filled with preparations and the purchase of necessities for the journey south. Pearl used some of her earnings from the cattle drive to buy fabric for new dresses, determined to begin her new life looking the part of a respectable ranch cook rather than a trail-worn runaway. On their final evening in Dodge, disaster nearly struck. Pearl was returning to the boarding house from a visit to the dressmaker when a familiar figure emerged from a saloon directly in her path. Vernon, clearly the worse for drink, swayed momentarily before his bloodshot eyes focused on her face. "Well, well," he slurred, blocking her way on the boardwalk. "If it isn't my wayward wife, fancy meeting you here, Pearl." Pearl froze, her packages clutched to her chest like a shield. "Vernon, what are you doing in Dodge?" "Looking for you, of course." His smile was ugly, the scar from Xavier's bullet visible at the collar of his shirt. "Did you think I'd just let you go, that I wouldn't track you down?" Pearl glanced around desperately, but the street was relatively empty in the early evening hour. "Our business is concluded, Vernon. Please let me pass." He reached for her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "We'll be concluding our business back in Texas, where a wife belongs with her husband. I've spoken to the marshal here. He says I have every right to reclaim you." "Let go of me," Pearl demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm not going anywhere with you." "I believe the lady asked you to release her," came Xavier's voice from behind them. He approached steadily, his expression dangerously calm as he took in Vernon's grip on Pearl's arm. "I suggest you comply, Montgomery." Vernon's face contorted with hatred. "You again. Haven't you learned your lesson about interfering between man and wife?" "Evidently not," Xavier replied, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "Now, take your hand off Mrs. Montgomery before I remove it for you." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the tension of the confrontation. Vernon, aware of the public nature of the scene, reluctantly released Pearl's arm. "This isn't the place," he growled. "But don't think this is over. I've spoken to the law here. They know she's my wife, and they know you've been helping her evade her rightful place." "Is that so?" Xavier raised an eyebrow. "Because I just came from the marshal's office myself. Had a most interesting conversation about a man from Texas with a history of domestic violence, trying to force his wife to return against her will." Vernon's confidence faltered slightly. He said, Xavier interrupted smoothly, "that while he can't legally prevent you from speaking to your wife, he certainly won't help you force her to go anywhere she doesn't wish to go, especially given the sworn statements provided by several witnesses regarding your treatment of her." Pearl looked at Xavier in surprise. He gave her a slight nod, confirming the truth of his words. During their time in Dodge, he had apparently been building legal protection for her, gathering statements from the cattle drive crew who had witnessed Vernon's pursuit and threats. Vernon's face darkened as he realized his advantage had evaporated. "This isn't finished," he snarled. "A wife belongs with her husband. The law and God both say so." "Perhaps," Xavier acknowledged, "but neither the law nor God condones the beating of a woman for burning supper. Now, I suggest you return to whatever hole you crawled out of, Montgomery, before the marshal takes an interest in your presence here." For a tense moment, it seemed Vernon might lunge at Xavier, public setting be damned. But a blue-uniformed figure approaching along the boardwalk, one of the Dodge City lawmen making his rounds, finally convinced him to back down. "Watch your back, Yates," he spat. And you, Pearl, you'll regret this betrayal, mark my words. With that, he shoved past them and disappeared into another saloon, leaving Pearl trembling in the aftermath of the encounter. Xavier quickly guided her away from the curious onlookers, his hand supportive at her elbow. "Are you all right?" he asked softly once they had turned onto a quieter street. Pearl nodded, though her heart still raced with fear and anger. "How did you know to come? How did you find me?" Mrs. Hollister at the boarding house mentioned you'd gone to the dressmaker. "I was on my way there to escort you back when I spotted Montgomery." Xavier's expression darkened. "I should have anticipated he might follow us to Dodge." "You can't protect me forever, Xavier," Pearl said quietly as they walked. "Eventually, I'll have to face him in a court of law if I ever hope to be truly free." Xavier was silent for a moment. "I know," he finally acknowledged. "But until then, I'll do everything in my power to ensure your safety and happiness, Pearl. That's a promise I intend to keep." As they reached the boarding house, Pearl paused on the front step, turning to face him. Why have you done all this for me? Risked so much for a woman you barely know?" Xavier's eyes held hers, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Because from the moment I tasted your cooking and asked for seconds, I knew you were someone special, Pearl Montgomery. Someone worth fighting for, worth protecting. And perhaps, someday when you're truly free, someone worth loving if you'll allow it." The simple honesty of his declaration stole Pearl's breath. For a moment they stood frozen in time, the possibilities of a future together hanging between them like a tangible thing. "I should go in," Pearl finally whispered, though everything within her longed to stay in this moment. "Mrs. Hollister will be wondering where I am." Xavier nodded, stepping back respectfully. "We leave for the JA ranch at dawn. Try to rest and don't worry about Montgomery. I've arranged for someone to keep an eye on him tonight." As Pearl entered the boarding house, her mind whirled with the implications of Xavier's words. For the first time, he had spoken openly of feelings beyond friendship, of possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. As a married woman, even one estranged from her husband, such thoughts should have brought shame. Instead, they kindled a warmth in her heart that felt remarkably like coming home. The journey to the JA ranch took nearly 3 weeks, their small party moving at a steady pace through Indian Territory and back into the Texas Panhandle. Unlike the cattle drive, this was a more comfortable journey, with proper wagons and frequent stops in established towns along the way. Vernon's threat lingered like a shadow over Pearl's happiness, but as the miles between them and Dodge City increased, his menacing presence seemed to fade. Xavier remained vigilant, but gradually, their conversations turned from immediate concerns of safety to more pleasant topics: the beauty of the landscape, plans for the future, and the growing connection between them. By the time they arrived at the JA Ranch, founded by John Adair and Charles Goodnight just 2 years earlier in 1876, Pearl had begun to believe that a new life was truly possible. The ranch headquarters sprawled across Palo Duro Canyon, a stunning natural formation of layered red rock and verdant valley floor that took Pearl's breath away when she first glimpsed it. Charles Goodnight himself greeted their arrival, a legendary figure in cattle ranching whose practical manner and shrewd eyes missed little. He welcomed Xavier warmly, having corresponded with him previously about the ranch position, and appraised Pearl with respectful interest when Xavier explained her situation in carefully worded terms. "My wife had a similar talent in the kitchen," Goodnight remarked after sampling Pearl's cooking during their first evening at the ranch. "Any woman who can make beans taste this good after weeks on the trail will be a welcome addition to our household." Mary Ann Goodnight, Charles's wife, proved equally welcoming, showing Pearl to the comfortable quarters attached to the main ranch house that would be hers as the household cook. After years of isolation in Vernon's cabin, the bustle of the ranch with its dozens of cowboys, workmen, and domestic staff was both overwhelming and exhilarating for Pearl. Xavier took up his duties as one of the ranch's skilled hands, working primarily with the prized Durham bulls that Goodnight was introducing to improve the Texas Longhorn stock. Though their daily responsibilities kept them apart for much of each day, they found moments to share meals where their eyes would meet across the long ranch table. evenings when Xavier would stop by the kitchen to compliment her cooking and exchange news of the day. As summer turned to fall, Pearl settled into her new role with growing confidence. The other ranch staff respected her abilities, and Mary Ann Goodnight became something of a mentor, teaching Pearl about ranch operations and including her in the social gatherings that occasionally brought neighboring ranchers to Palo Duro. At one such gathering in October, nearly 3 months after their arrival at the JA, Pearl was serving coffee in the ranch house parlor when she overheard a conversation that sent a chill through her veins. Strange business over in Tascosa last week, a visiting rancher was telling Goodnight. Fellow named Montgomery making a nuisance of himself, asking after a woman he claims is his runaway wife. Offering a reward for information. Pearl's hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the coffee pot. Xavier, who had been engaged in conversation across the room, noticed immediately and moved to her side. "What's wrong?" he murmured, taking the pot from her unsteady hands. "Vernon," she whispered. "He's in Tascosa looking for me." Xavier's expression hardened, but before he could respond, Charles Goodnight joined them, having noted their distress. "Mrs. Montgomery," he said quietly, "I believe this concerns you. Would you care to explain the situation?" With Xavier's supportive presence beside her, Pearl revealed her full history to Goodnight: Vernon's abuse, her escape with the cattle drive, and their confrontation in Dodge City. She omitted nothing, including Xavier's role in her flight and the legal complications of her still valid marriage. Goodnight listened without interruption, his weathered face betraying little emotion until she finished. Then he nodded once, decisively. "No man who raises his hand to a woman is welcome on my property," he stated. "Your husband will not find you here, Mrs. Montgomery. I'll make certain of that." The directness of his support nearly brought Pearl to tears. "Thank you, Mr. Goodnight, but I don't wish to bring trouble to your ranch. Trouble comes whether we invite it or not," Goodnight replied philosophically. "The question is how we meet it when it arrives." He turned to Xavier. "Yates, you've proven your worth these past months. I trust your judgment in this matter." Xavier straightened. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Montgomery's safety is my primary concern." Goodnight assessed them both with shrewd eyes that missed little of the connection between them. "I see," he said simply. "Well then, we'll increase patrols around the ranch perimeter. If this Montgomery character shows his face on JA land, he'll be dealt with appropriately." With that assurance, the immediate crisis passed, though Pearl found herself glancing over her shoulder more frequently in the days that followed. Xavier took to riding escort whenever she needed to travel to nearby settlements for supplies, his protective presence both comforting and a stark reminder of the threat that still loomed over her new life. As Christmas approached, bringing with it the ranch's traditional celebration, Pearl found herself taking stock of the remarkable changes in her circumstances since that fateful day when Xavier had tasted her burned beans and asked for seconds. From a beaten wife trapped in a cycle of abuse, she had transformed into a respected member of the JA ranch community, valued for her skills and embraced for her gentle spirit. Only one shadow remained her legal ties to Vernon. Though she had not seen him since Dodge City, his presence hovered at the edges of her happiness, a persistent reminder that she was not truly free to build a future with Xavier, whose feelings for her had grown increasingly evident despite his careful adherence to propriety. The matter came to a head on Christmas Eve, as Pearl was putting the finishing touches on the elaborate feast she had prepared for the ranch's celebration. Xavier found her in the kitchen, surrounded by the aromas of roasting turkey, spiced apple pie, and her special corn pudding that had become a favorite among the ranch hands. "Smells like heaven itself," he remarked, leaning against the doorframe with a smile that never failed to quicken her pulse. "The men are already gathering, talking about how they've been saving their appetites for days in anticipation." Pearl laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. "They'd say that regardless of what I served. Cowboys are always hungry." "True, but they're not always appreciative of the cook." "You've won them all over, Pearl, just as you've—" He trailed off, seeming to reconsider his words. Pearl looked up from the pie she was glazing, catching the intensity in his gaze. "Just as I've what, Xavier?" He straightened, moving into the kitchen with purpose. "I received a letter today from the attorney I consulted in Dodge. He's been making inquiries on your behalf." Xavier withdrew an envelope from his pocket. He believes he's found a legal path to your freedom if you wish to pursue it. Pearl's heart leaped, though she kept her expression composed as she accepted the letter. What does he suggest? Colorado has more progressive laws regarding divorce, particularly in cases involving cruelty. If you were to establish residence there for 6 months, you could file a petition that would likely be granted, especially with the witness statements we've collected. 6 months in Colorado would mean leaving the JA, leaving Xavier. Pearl's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the letter and scanned its contents. There's more, Xavier continued, his voice gentle. Goodnight has connections in Denver. He's offered to arrange a position for you there with a family he knows. It would be respectable work, and you'd be well protected until the legal matters are resolved. Pearl looked up from the letter, searching his face. You've discussed this with Mr. Goodnight, Xavier nodded. He approached me, actually. He's more observant than we might have given him credit for. He sees what's developing between us, Pearl. And he believes, as I do, that you deserve the chance at a truly fresh start, one that isn't shadowed by Vernon's legal claims. The possibility of complete freedom after years of subjugation was almost too overwhelming to comprehend. Pearl set the letter aside, turning back to her cooking to hide the tears that threatened. And what of you, Xavier? What would you do while I'm in Colorado? She felt him move closer, though he maintained a respectful distance. I would wait, he said simply, for however long it takes, and when you're truly free, if you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly, Pearl Montgomery. No shadows, no looking over our shoulders. Just a man and a woman building something real together. Pearl turned to face him, her heart so full she could scarcely breathe. You would wait 6 months. What if the divorce is contested? It could take longer. Xavier's smile was steady, his eyes reflecting the depth of his feelings. I would wait years, if necessary. What we could have is worth waiting for. In that moment, surrounded by the fruits of her labor in a kitchen that had become her domain, Pearl made her decision. Yes, she said softly. Yes to Colorado. Yes to pursuing the divorce, and yes, Xavier Yates, to allowing you to court me properly when I return. The joy that illuminated his face was worth every hardship she had endured to reach this point. Though propriety prevented him from taking her in his arms as he clearly longed to do, the promise that passed between them in that moment was as binding as any physical touch. Merry Christmas, Pearl, he said softly. Merry Christmas, Xavier, she replied, her smile reflecting the hope that had blossomed in her heart. The JA Ranch's Christmas celebration that evening was joyous and boisterous, with cowboys, ranch hands, and the Goodnights themselves enjoying Pearl's feast with enthusiastic appreciation. As she moved among them, serving seconds and accepting compliments with gracious modesty, Pearl felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. Later, as the gathering wound down and most of the men retired to their quarters, Charles Goodnight drew Pearl and Xavier aside for a private word. In his direct manner, he confirmed the arrangements for Pearl's journey to Colorado, scheduled for mid-January after the worst of winter's fury had passed. My friend Judge Halsey and his wife will welcome you into their household in Denver, he told Pearl. They're good people who understand your situation. The judge, in particular, has strong opinions about men who abuse their wives. Goodnight's expression softened slightly. Mary Ann and I will miss your cooking, Mrs. Montgomery, but we believe this is the right course for you. I can never thank you enough for your kindness, Mr. Goodnight, Pearl replied sincerely. No thanks needed. Just promise you'll return to the Panhandle when your business in Colorado is concluded. Good cooks are hard to find in these parts. His knowing glance between her and Xavier made it clear he understood the deeper reason she would return. The weeks leading up to Pearl's departure passed too quickly. January brought clearing skies and milder temperatures, perfect conditions for the stage-coach journey that would take her first to Amarillo, then by train to Denver. Xavier threw himself into preparations, ensuring her comfort and safety for the trip with a thoroughness that touched Pearl deeply. On her final evening at the JA Ranch, after a farewell supper with the Goodnights, Xavier walked Pearl back to her quarters beneath a canopy of brilliant Texas stars. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. A token to remember our agreement. He pressed a small object into her palm, a simple silver band etched with a pattern of intertwined vines. "It's not a ring of promise exactly," he explained. "That would be presumptuous while you're still legally tied to another. Consider it instead a symbol of possibility of what awaits when you return." Pearl closed her fingers around the band, too moved to speak for a moment. "It's beautiful," she finally managed. "I'll treasure it, Xavier." "There's one more thing," he said, his expression growing serious. "If Vernon should somehow find you in Colorado, if you should feel threatened in any way, telegraph me immediately. I'll come no matter the distance." Pearl nodded, though she prayed such a situation would never arise. "I will." "But Judge Halsey sounds formidable, and Denver is far from Vernon's usual haunts." "Nevertheless," Xavier insisted, "promise me, Pearl." "I promise," she agreed, warmed by his concern. They parted that night with nothing more than a clasp of hands, the proprieties still observed despite the depth of feeling between them. But the silver band nestled in Pearl's palm carried with it all the promises neither could yet speak aloud. Dawn brought the stagecoach and a brief, emotion-filled farewell. As the coach pulled away from the J.A. ranch, Pearl looked back to see Xavier standing tall and straight, his hat raised in salute, his figure growing smaller with each turning of the wheels that carried her toward freedom. The journey to Denver passed without incident, the winter landscape of the plains giving way to the dramatic rise of the Rocky Mountains as Pearl traveled northward. Judge William Halsey and his wife Eleanor met her at the Denver station, their warm welcome setting the tone for what would become 6 months of healing and preparation for her new life. The Halseys, as Charles Goodnight had promised, were kind and understanding hosts. Their spacious home near the center of Denver became Pearl's sanctuary as she adjusted to city life and began the legal process of severing her ties to Vernon. Judge Halsey, a silver-haired man with penetrating blue eyes and a reputation for strict but fair rulings, took personal interest in Pearl's case. Though he could not preside over it himself due to the conflict of interest, his guidance proved invaluable as she navigated the complexities of Colorado's divorce laws. "The witness statements from the cattle drive crew are compelling," he told her one evening as they reviewed her petition. "Combined with the sheriff's testimony from Dalhart and the medical examination Dr. Eleanor arranged, I believe you have a strong case for divorce on grounds of cruelty." Eleanor Halsey, a pioneering female physician who had fought her own battles for recognition in a male-dominated field, became both friend and mentor to Pearl during those months. Under her guidance, Pearl expanded her culinary skills, learning to prepare the sophisticated dishes favored by Denver's high society, while also studying basic accounting and household management. "A truly independent woman must understand her own finances," Eleanor insisted, teaching Pearl to track expenses and balance accounts with the same precision she applied to her medical practice. Letters from Xavier arrived regularly, carefully worded due to her still married status, but filled with news of the J.A. ranch and subtle reminders of his unwavering feelings. Pearl kept them bundled with ribbon in a drawer beside her bed, reading them on lonely evenings when Denver's unfamiliarity pressed in around her. The silver band he had given her became a talisman of sorts, worn on a chain beneath her clothing where it rested close to her heart. Though she had made friends among the Halseys' circle and found satisfaction in her work, Xavier's absence was a constant ache that only the promise of reunion could soothe. Spring brought her divorce hearing, a tense day of testimony before a judge who listened impassively as Pearl recounted Vernon's abuses and the circumstances of her flight. The Halseys sat supportively in the courtroom, their presence lending respectability to her petition, while the sworn statements from Dalhart and the cattle drive provided the corroboration required by law. Vernon, notified of the proceedings as required, did not appear to contest the divorce. Whether distance, expense, or some other factor kept him away, Pearl couldn't guess, but his absence was a blessing she hadn't dared hope for. When the judge finally granted her petition, declaring her marriage to Vernon Montgomery legally dissolved under Colorado law, Pearl wept with relief. The Halseys escorted her home for a quiet celebration, Eleanor producing a bottle of champagne saved for special occasions. To new beginnings, Judge Halsey toasted, raising his glass, and to the courage it takes to claim them. That night, Pearl wrote to Xavier with hands that trembled from emotion rather than fear, sharing the news of her freedom and her plans to return to Texas once her 6 months of residency were complete. His reply, arriving with unprecedented speed, contained just 2 lines. "The JA awaits your return, as do I with a heart full of hope. Yours always, Xavier." The remaining weeks of her Colorado residency passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. By June, with her divorce final and her obligations to the Halseys fulfilled, Pearl boarded the train that would carry her back to the Texas Panhandle, back to the life she had chosen for herself, back to Xavier. The journey south seemed interminable, each mile stretching endlessly before her. When the train finally pulled into Amarillo Station on a brilliant summer morning, Pearl gathered her belongings with hands that shook from nerves and excitement. As she stepped onto the platform, scanning the crowd for the JA ranch hand who was supposed to meet her, her gaze instead landed on a tall figure standing apart from the others, his familiar stance causing her heart to leap in her chest. Xavier had come himself, his broad shoulders and dark hair unmistakable even at a distance. When their eyes met across the crowded platform, the months of separation seemed to vanish in an instant. He moved toward her, removing his hat as he approached, his smile warming his entire face. "Pearl," he said simply when he reached her, as if her name alone contained all he wished to express. "Xavier," she replied, her own voice betraying the depth of her emotion. "I didn't expect you to come yourself." "Wild horses couldn't have kept me away," he assured her, taking her carpetbag despite her protests. "The ranch can survive without me for a day." His eyes took in every detail of her appearance, noting the new confidence in her bearing, the healthy glow that had replaced the fearful pallor of their first meeting. "You look wonderful," Pearl smiled, feeling a blush warm her cheeks. "Denver agreed with me, I think. Though I've missed Texas more than I expected." She met his gaze directly. "I've missed you, Xavier," his expression softened. "I've counted the days, Pearl, every single one." They stood for a moment in the swirl of station activity, reconnecting without words before Xavier gestured toward the exit. "I've arranged rooms at the hotel in town. The ranch is a day's journey, and I thought, that is, I hoped we might have dinner together this evening. To celebrate your return." Pearl understood immediately the significance of his suggestion. No longer constrained by her married status, they were free to begin the courtship he had promised, observing all the proper forms now that no shadow hung over their relationship. "I would like that very much," she agreed, falling into step beside him as they left the station. That evening, seated across from Xavier in the hotel's small but respectable dining room, Pearl felt as though her life had come full circle. Once again, they shared a meal, but this time without fear or secrets between them. Xavier was handsome in his best shirt, his hair neatly trimmed, his manner that perfect blend of confidence and respect that had first drawn her to him. They talked easily of her time in Denver, of changes at the JA ranch, and gradually of more personal matters. "I still have the band you gave me," Pearl told him, touching the chain at her neck where it remained hidden. "It's been a source of strength on difficult days." Xavier's eyes darkened with emotion. "I hoped it might be, just as your letters have sustained me these past months." He hesitated, then reached across the table to take her hand. "Pearl, I know traditionally there would be a longer period of courtship, but given all we've already shared." He withdrew a small box from his pocket, setting it on the table between them. "This isn't a demand or an expectation," he clarified quickly. "Only a question which you're free to answer however your heart guides you." Pearl's breath caught as she looked from the box to Xavier's face. "What are you asking, Xavier?" "I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife," he said simply. "Not immediately, but when you feel ready, whether that's months or years from now, my feelings won't change." With trembling fingers, Pearl opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. Unlike the ostentatious ring Vernon had presented during their courtship, a family heirloom he'd later admitted was only paste. This was genuine in its simplicity, much like the man who offered it. "I know your first marriage has given you every reason to distrust the institution," Xavier continued when she remained speechless. and I would understand completely if you wished never to enter it again. But I want you to know that my love for you is certain, Pearl, whether or not you ever wear this ring." Pearl closed her eyes briefly, the word love washing over her like a healing balm. When she had left Vernon's cabin that dawn nearly a year ago, she could never have imagined finding herself here, being offered a future built on mutual respect and genuine affection. "My first marriage taught me what love isn't," she said softly, meeting Xavier's anxious gaze. "But you, Xavier Yates, have shown me what love truly is, not in grand gestures or pretty words, but in simple kindnesses, in tasting burned beans and asking for seconds, in respecting my choices even when they took me away from you, in waiting patiently for me to find my own strength." She picked up the ring, examining its sparkle in the lamplight. "I don't fear marriage to you, Xavier. In fact, I can think of nothing I want more than to build a life with you." The joy that transformed his face was answer enough to any doubts that might have lingered in her heart. "Is that a yes?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Pearl smiled, the happiness she had once thought forever beyond her reach now filling every corner of her being. "Yes, Xavier, it's a yes." They were married 2 months later in the small church near the J.A. ranch, with Charles and Mary Ann Goodnight standing as witnesses, and the ranch hands forming an enthusiastic congregation. Pearl wore a gown of ivory silk that Alina Halsey had helped her select in Denver, while Xavier cut a handsome figure in a new suit purchased for the occasion. Their vows were simple but profound, each word weighted with the journey that had brought them to this moment. When Xavier placed the gold band on Pearl's finger, joining it with the engagement ring she now wore openly, she felt the last shadows of her past finally lift away. The Goodnight's wedding gift was a small parcel of land on the edge of J.A. property, along with lumber and labor to build a modest home. Xavier, who had saved carefully during his years of ranching, added livestock and equipment to establish their own small but viable ranch operation. "You'll still cook for the main house until we find a replacement," Goodnight told Pearl with his characteristic directness. "Can't have the men starving just because Yates finally convinced you to marry him," Pearl laughed, happiness making her bold. "I'd be delighted to continue, Mr. Goodnight, though perhaps not every day once our own place is established." "Fair enough," he conceded with a rare smile. "A woman should put her own household first." Their honeymoon was a week-long journey to San Antonio, where Xavier introduced Pearl to his sister and her family, completing the circle of connection that had begun with his mother's flight from an abusive marriage years before. "She would have loved you," his sister assured Pearl as they prepared to return to the Panhandle. "She always said Xavier had the kindest heart of any man she'd ever known. I'm glad he found someone worthy of it." Returning to their new life at the J.A. ranch, Pearl and Xavier settled into a rhythm of hard work and simple pleasures. Their home, completed by early winter, became known for its warmth and hospitality, with Pearl's cooking drawing visitors from across the Panhandle. Xavier's expertise with cattle brought offers of partnership from neighboring ranchers, while Pearl's expanding garden and preserves created a small but profitable side business supplying specialty goods to merchants in Amarillo and Tascosa. News of Vernon occasionally reached them through the ranching grapevine. He had moved to New Mexico territory after failing to contest the divorce, his bitterness and drinking eventually landing him in trouble with authorities there. Pearl received the information with equanimity. The man who had once controlled her life now reduced to a distant figure from a past that no longer held power over her. Their first child, a son they named James after Xavier's father, arrived in the spring of 1880, bringing new joy to their growing home. A daughter, Sarah, followed 18 months later, her arrival coinciding with the completion of additions to their ranch house. By 1883, the Yates Ranch had grown to a respectable operation, with a small herd of quality cattle and a reputation for fair dealing that brought steady business. Pearl continued to cook occasionally for special events at the J.A. main house, her dishes becoming legendary throughout the region. On the 5th anniversary of the day Xavier had first tasted her burned beans and asked for seconds, he surprised Pearl with a special dinner at their home, sending the children to stay with friends for the evening. "What's the occasion?" Pearl asked as he set the table with their best dishes, normally reserved for important guests. Xavier smiled, the same smile that still quickened her pulse after 5 years of marriage. "Don't you remember what day it is?" Pearl paused, counting back through the calendar in her mind. When realization dawned, her eyes widened. "The day we met, the burned beans." "The day that changed everything," Xavier confirmed, lighting the candles he had placed on the table. "I thought we should commemorate it properly." From the kitchen, he brought out a pot of beans, deliberately scorched around the edges just enough to lend them that distinctive smoky flavor. Pearl laughed delightedly at the gesture. "You burned them on purpose," she exclaimed, touched by the thoughtfulness behind the symbolic act. "Just a little," he admitted with a grin. "Though I'll never match your original masterpiece." As they shared the meal, memories of that first encounter flowing between them, Pearl marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a beaten wife with no hope for the future to a respected rancher's wife, mother, and businesswoman in her own right, the transformation seemed almost unbelievable. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, noting her reflective expression. Pearl reached across the table to take his hand, her heart full. "I was thinking about how a single act of kindness can change a life, how a man tasting burned beans and asking for seconds could lead to all of this." She gestured to their home, to the evidence of the life they had built together. Xavier squeezed her hand gently. "I think it was less about the beans and more about the woman who cooked them," he said softly. "I knew then what I know with even greater certainty now, that you, Pearl Yates, are the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known." "We found each other when we most needed to," Pearl replied, her voice warm with emotion. "And I thank God every day that you happened to ride up to that cabin just when you did." As darkness settled over the Texas Panhandle, bringing with it a blanket of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon, Pearl and Xavier Yates sat together on their porch, their hands intertwined, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the land they had claimed as their own. From burned beans and desperate circumstances had grown a love story as resilient and enduring as the rugged landscape around them, a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and second chances in the wild heart of the West.